Hi, everybody. Welcome so much to our roundtable discussion about women in esports. Today, I'd like to kick things off by having everyone introduce themselves. And I'm just going to go down the line here on my screen. Anu, would you please introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, my name is Jain. I'm the Executive Director for the Gender Equity Commission, which is in the Mayor's Office of Equity in the city of Pittsburgh.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Lindsey, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Lindsey. I am an assistant professor at SUNY Cortland. I do a lot of work and research in gender equity, women in leadership, and I've just gotten into some of that work in the esports space. So I do it mostly in traditional sport, now transitioning to esports. So I'm happy to be here.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for being here. Rose, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure, Angelica. Thank you. My name is Rose Kopp, and I'm a business experience planning and administration advisor within technology and innovation at PNC. I lead the program management office for our strategic technology initiatives and am the current program manager for 2 of our innovation programs. But in addition to my day job, I am a PNC certified women's business advocate. I sit on our technology and innovation diversity and inclusion council. And I am also a member of PNC's leadership team for our Women in Tech group. So I am super excited to be in this panel. I've seen Lindsey on the previous panel, so I'm excited to have a conversation with her. And really just want to thank you and the Pittsburgh Knights for inviting me to this session, because it's really an important conversation to have, and it's something I'm extremely passionate about. So excited to hear from all the amazing women that you have on the line.
Likewise, thank you. And Sonia, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks for having me today. My name is Sonia Ruef. I'm an assistant athletic trainer with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I've been with the organization for the past, I'm going on my 10th season now, so happy to be here.
Well, this is fantastic. Again, thank you all for joining us. So today I wanted to tap into some people who are outside of the esports industry and outside of that world to see what we can learn and what else is going on out there in terms of what people and organizations and industries are doing to promote inclusivity. And I'd like to learn a little bit about what has helped you individually, what you've seen really positive in either your organization or other organizations that you've seen or heard of. And I'd like to get a feel for what esports can learn from what is already happening out there in the world. So one of my first questions today is, esports is still a developing industry. Nothing is really set in stone yet here. Everything is still really new and growing. Is there anything that you would like to say or offer in terms of what a new industry could do to set itself up for success? If you got to strip everything down and start anew, what would a growing industry, what could a growing industry like esports benefit from in terms of inclusivity initiatives where there's no institutional, policies already in place that are putting things one way or another? Where would we start? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
If I could jump in as probably, the most casual of the gamers, however, we decide to find that this is something that I do with individual organizations, and I've done with especially nonprofits in Pittsburgh. So I'm also in the past, in addition to working now on policy in local government, I was a professor of gender and narrative for about 10 years, and I founded a consulting company, and I've worked with over 80 organizations in the Pittsburgh area. So what I'm going to say to you is what I say to everyone in all of these contexts. If you don't build it from the beginning with some core principles of inclusion, it's very hard to later bolt those on. And that's Candy Castleberry Singleton, who used to work for UPMC, one of our major employers in the Pittsburgh area. It's the title of a book that she wrote, and what she always says is you can't bolt it on. And I'm now thinking you have to build it in. And so that means that at every stage, you look around metaphorically or really at the people who are helping you to build this industry, and you say, who's not here? When I think about the diversity of human experience, who do I not see? Who's over indexed, right? White and male, probably in many industries. If you stop and ask yourself that question and you don't go forward without making sure to fill in gaps of who's missing, you're always going to be behind the curve. You're going to be trying to catch up on inclusion because you didn't build it in. So I just want to ask, say, and it's just a great question to ask yourself always. When I look at my neighborhood, who's missing? When I look at the leadership C-suite, who's missing? People with disabilities, people who historically oppressed, people who are not racially white. So I just wanted to frame it, and then I'm thrilled to hear from people who know this industry.
So that's such a great point to start with. And so a question that I would have is there any way that if you look around and you see, my industry isn't so diverse, are there any best practices out there or tried and true methods that companies can employ or organizations or individuals can employ to say, how can I get more diversity? How can I help this community of people be more inclusive?
I can go ahead and try to speak to that and kind of elaborate on what Anu just spoke about. So my setting, being professional football, is inherently male dominated. So that's kind of hard to just get past that first part because the players are all males. They kind of have to be at this particular level right now. But you are seeing increasing numbers of females in the other staff positions in the organizations, in teams themselves, but also at the NFL office. I know the NFL has been pushing to increase diversity in many positions across the board. People of different color, but also people of different gender. They really want to push women in more roles. And you're seeing that more and more with the addition of some female coaches on teams. There's female referees now. I started out as the only female full-time athletic trainer in the NFL. Prior to me with the Steelers, there was another female. So the Steelers were the only team that had a full-time female athletic trainer on staff. And so I think it was 13 years, there was only one. And then my 4th year with the Steelers, they started to add more female athletic trainers to other teams, and now I'm one of 9. So the number is definitely growing. But to speak to Anu's point about kind of thinking about kind of building diversity from the beginning, it's hard from our standpoint because it was just a boys' club from the very beginning. And it is more challenging now to add in female roles just from logistical standpoints. Like you need to make sure that there are female locker rooms in facilities. I know when I was first starting out those first few years, most of the away stadiums didn't have a place for me to change clothes. I was always changing in a public restroom. But in the last few years, they've mandated that all NFL stadiums have to have a female locker room for those female staffs. So it's definitely, it's easier if you do it from the beginning, but now like for industries or things that are just beginning, that's a great point just to build that in from the get-go, logistically thinking about what amenities they need to be included to include many different kinds of people. But so that's one part of it. And then also just internship opportunities. I would say the majority of NFL athletic trainers started out as interns at one point, and that is really the best job interview there is. That's how people really prove themselves, and they were able to show that they belong in those roles. So again, this was back my 4th season with the NFL. We had a meeting with the commissioner, Roger Goodell, myself, and some of the other head athletic trainers of the teams across the league, and just talking to him about different issues that the NFL athletic trainers face. And one of them was the diversity issue, me being the only female. And, I remember the commissioner asking me, how do we go about increasing females? Like, what's the best way in your opinion? And I told him, internships are the route to go, because that's how, if you look at all the NFL athletic trainers in the league right now, most of them started as interns. So you just have to create more internship opportunities for females, in addition to other minorities. So they've always had minority scholarships for internships in the NFL. So after that meeting, they created a separate scholarship for females. So now we have minority and female scholarships for every team for these internships. And that really has kind of paved the way for more full-time female athletic trainers being hired.
I love that idea. I know that in one of our past conversations, we were speaking with WNBA player Ariel Powers, and we were talking about the path to becoming a pro athlete, either traditional sports or esports. And one of the things that she said that stood out to me was that when she was a child, she was playing, basketball on public courts, and it was mostly boys playing, but that once they saw her play, once, her dad was supporting her, helping her, build up her self-esteem to go out there onto the court and say, hey, this is my game, I'm going to play right now. Once boys saw her playing, they were so much more understanding and accepting of like, wow, this girl can play. So creating these opportunities where people who might not have had the opportunity to see, a woman excelling in a sport or a woman excelling on a certain career path, I think is really valuable. So I love that you just said that. I really see a similarity there. Does anybody else have any other thoughts of practices that companies could employ, or things that people could do individually to try to, open up a conversation about inclusivity and diversity?
Angelica, I just add to the point that you made regarding ensuring diversity and inclusion are always at the forefront. I think that, we heard in the first roundtable discussion from a lot of the gamers who said that they don't turn on their mics because of the backlash, right? Or the way they're treated in the game. So part of that ensuring that diversity and inclusion is at the forefront is really establishing standards for behavior and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, not letting that unconscious bias or intentional bias creep into the game. I really think that esports is in a unique position in that, traditional sports have always had that male-female counterpart. So think about when you went to school, you had the boys basketball team and the girls basketball team. And even where there wasn't a counterpart, right? We didn't have a girls football team, but the girls were the cheerleaders. And that's that societal bias, right? That how we grew up or how we've seen things that often creep in. So I know in one of your previous conversations, you said, like, should we have a male and female league? And I would argue no, because you're in the unique position to really embrace the diverse perspectives that women bring to the game. There are a lot of studies out there that say women approach problem solving differently. That's not to say an all-female team is better than an all-male team. It means that if you have men and women at the table with the diverse perspectives and the diverse approaches to problem solving, that they are more effective, that they are more efficient, that corporations are more profitable because their teams are more effective and more efficient. So I think that you really have a unique opportunity. And I would add to that the most recent McKinsey study that came out talking about the impacts of COVID to women in the workforce, and how it's going to be have a huge impact, because a lot of women are going to have to step back from their roles in organizations and corporations because they have to take care of things at home. Whereas I know that I've talked to a lot of my peers who have daughters at home that say, during this COVID crisis, when they were locked down and they couldn't socialize, they turned to gaming. And that's how they had that socialization aspect. So I think that this could really be a pivotal moment for esports and what COVID has brought to a lot of young girls and women, bringing them to the game. So I think that you're in a very unique and exciting position, and it's an exciting time for you.
And I can
So-
kind of go off of what everyone,
please,
I'll
yeah.
add in one piece, because going off of what everyone's saying and then relating that to traditional sport and non-traditional sport, it is at a disadvantage, right? Because it did develop largely by men, white men in most cases. So we are kind of playing catch up, and you just kind of have to play catch up in a lot of instances. What we're finding works is sponsorship in a lot of ways. So mentorship is kind of out. Mentorship is old news. Let's sponsor women and women from underrepresented groups into these roles and into these careers, because without that, they may not gain the experience necessary. I know we were talking about that. Sonia mentioned internships. That's a key part to all of this, but we need to sponsor women. Men have benefited from sponsorship throughout history, but especially in sport. If you're good and they want to hire you, they're just going to hire you. It's not just about doing phone calls and mentorship anymore. It's, if you know a woman is good, hire her, right? So bring her into the organization.
Can I clarify one thing? So when you started to speak, and partly because I'm not in a sports industry, and you talked about sponsorship, I was thinking about when companies sponsor, or you know, or somebody has the contract with a certain company and gets lots of money to represent them. But then as you were talking, I thought you were talking about the leadership term of sponsoring someone, which is different than the mentoring term. So I didn't know if you were talking about both.
No, so this is really emerging. It's largely coming out of my own research, this concept of sponsorship. So we really just mean, the actual process of bringing somebody in, hiring that person. It happens a lot in coaching already. So you have a lot of champions of women assistant coaches who will say, I had this athlete, she was fantastic, I'm going to hire her right into a full-time assistant coaching job. That's not really mentorship, or a lot of us in this sports management space are finding it's not really mentorship anymore. It really is, you're kind of going out on a limb and you're hiring that person and bringing them into a full-time position. So, and we may need to finagle the terminology a little bit too, but yeah, I mean, we're moving kind of beyond the idea of just networking as a way to get jobs.
So what's really exciting to me, and I didn't mean to cut you off, I'm really like excited because so my research when I was an academic was interdisciplinary, and so you're actually mentioning a third way of using the term sponsorship, but the intersection here, and Lindsey, I can send you the reference later, but a business professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Audrey Morell, writes a lot about women's leadership, and one of the threads of conversation, and this is a kind of specific thing, so studies have found that when men mentor women, that the women succeed because the male mentors become invested in their success. But Audrey Morell and other scholars of leadership studies in business have talked about we need to go further than that to sponsor, which means that you not just help someone within your own organization, or you not just support them, hire them, etc., but you look for exceptional people in your industry who are from underrepresented groups, and to no benefit of your own necessarily, you help uplift them. So mentorship tends to be within, either informally, but it can be within a company, or it can be the formal kinds of things, the sponsorship that Lindsey was talking about. But I think that there's this other way to think about it, given what the studies say. And I hear this, and I think one of the people in the roundtable said it, the idea that a lot of men in whatever sector, so I'm going to speak more broadly, might be very sympathetic to pay gap and to bias against women and to structural inequalities, but they don't necessarily see it as their responsibility or impacting them, that it's given them a leg up. And so it's a way of expanding their privilege, extending their privilege, excuse me, to say that, you know, I'm the dominant gender here, so I have a little more of an ability to help uplift people who are in the underrepresented group, right? And so really use your own, and there's a way in which by sponsorship, there is a slight risk, because if I sponsor someone, if I say this person is great, you know, we really need it to support them, and they don't do well, or you know, so there's a reputational risk. But there's another way in which it's really it's about intentionality. It's about saying, I can do this. It's also my responsibility. It's not just women who should be asking questions about women in esports. Everyone in esports should be saying, hey, how do we do this? Because exactly as Rose said, it's in everyone's best interest. We get better, cooler, more creative ideas that are more profitable when women are involved.
So It's so great what we're talking about. Can you guys talk a little bit more about why it's beneficial to have these diverse and inclusive groups? Because I think on a surface level, everybody goes, yeah, that sounds great. Like, of course we should have more inclusive groups, but can you get a little bit deeper and educate us a little bit as to why, what those benefits are maybe?
I can try to speak to that from, again, from an athletic training standpoint. So it's, you know, I'm a healthcare professional. So if you think about the healthcare professionals you might all see, you know, you go to a female doctor or a male doctor, both are very qualified. And depending on the person, they may have preferences towards one gender or the other. The same thing happens in sports. You know, obviously I just work with male athletes, but you'd be surprised at how many people gravitate towards me versus my male coworkers. Sometimes maybe it's because they grew up in a single parent household, they were raised by their mother, and they're just used to going to a female person to get care from, or that's where they know that they feel comfortable around when they may be vulnerable or hurt. So, and then in other situations, there's players that prefer my male coworkers, but it's just like, again, if I wasn't on staff, that would be one piece of the puzzle that was missing. They wouldn't have that option to go to. As our head athletic trainer tells the team at the beginning of the season every year, like, you know, we're here to help you, you know, make sure you don't let the big or the little things become big things. If you don't like me, go to Sonia. If you don't like Sonia, go to Davion. If you don't like Davion, go to Dina. So it's like it, and we're lucky to have a diverse staff to treat all these players that are coming from different backgrounds. So that kind of touches on, you know, why it is important to have that diversity with people that do have different backgrounds, different experiences. In my job, in any healthcare profession, really, the heart of really being good at what you do is relating to your patients, having something to connect with them on. And if everybody has the same background, it's going to be hard to do that when you have players, a team with a wide spectrum of backgrounds and personalities.
Yeah, and Angelica, just to kind of cite the McKinsey study that I referenced, and I forget what year it is. I feel like there's a, you know, we know they put out studies frequently, but the study indicated that diverse teams process facts more carefully. They are more likely to constantly re-examine facts and remain objective. They're more innovative, and they've increased creativity over teams that are not diverse. They are better problem solvers and decision makers because the diverse backgrounds that the diversity in the teammates that make up the team bring a diversity in the solutions to the table that lead to more informed decision making and more improved results. And then the more profitable piece of it was that teams that are obviously better problem solvers and better decision makers, they create a competitive advantage for the organization, and then in turn make more money for the organization. They cite higher employee engagement. If your employees are happy, they're going to be productive, right? And so I think there are a lot of studies out there that have proven the facts behind why diversity matters. And again, we were talking about leveling the playing field and bringing women, you know, how do we bring women along? And it's not to say that eShirts should be taken over by women. It's not the, you know, I am woman, hear me roar. It's we want a seat at the table, and that's a very different conversation. And I think that another component that I am of is the male advocates. So as you bring these women into the fold, you are also by nature creating male advocates. As their teammates, you have these diverse teams. They see the diversity and you know, what the women bring to the table, and then they become advocates for women at such a young age that they carry that along. So and I think that another thing that I would add, it's important to think of for esports, to think of not only the game today, but the game not just focusing on today's talent pipeline, but how do you invest in the future of esports? So from taking the perspective from being a consumer of talent to an investor in talent, and how do you get to the young girls to get them interested in gaming?
And we also have to I'll add in a little bit too, we have to let the process work, because a lot of times, unfortunately, I talk to my students about this too, when you bring in diverse leadership, they tend to be rated. If you have a rating system in place, obviously as a professor, we have scores, and the students fill out evaluations on us after each semester. Diverse individuals tend to be rated lower. So even with those good organizational outcomes, we still implicitly tend to rate these individuals a little bit lower than white men. So that's a problem too, and that's growing pains, because it's about representation. It's about making this more normalized. We've talked about that on other panels too. And it's also about understanding that employees want different types of leaders now too, which diversity can help with that. They want someone who understands that work isn't everything. They want someone who understands that they can be ethical and still have, good production in the office, right? So, but I think the important piece here is we can bring in diversity and we can bring in diverse groups to lead organizations, but we have to give it time to sort of settle as well. And we have to not be so jumpy with the implicit biases and take those into account, because those leaders can be rated lower. So we have to sort of get over that hump, and sport is dealing with that now too. Women coaches are ranked usually lower than their male counterparts. They get fired more frequently. They don't get rehired if they get fired. So giving the process a chance to work its way through and creating more role models and more consistent role modeling throughout the process.
So can I ask a question about that, Lindsey? Because when you say giving the process a chance to work through, the first thing that comes to my mind is, and I'm a little bit biased because I'm from Pittsburgh and I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, but I feel like the Steelers are one of the absolute best teams in the NFL, and they have been for a really long time. And one of the things that I've always thought is unique and probably very foundational to the Steelers' success is the fact that their head coaches are their head coaches for so long. Whereas you see other organizations where they're like, that guy had a bad season, he's going to be out. And then they keep turning over. And there's a lot of, I don't know, things don't get a chance to play out sort of in the way that you said. Yeah. Is that a good example?
We call this sort of like the glass cliff for women in sport and women in other industries. So this idea that, and we're seeing it more now. I get a little bit nervous when I see individuals from underrepresented groups being brought onto a team or into an organization that has been failing for so long. Because there's a chance it's not going to go well for the first couple of years, but they will still likely get fired from that position. Like they were set up to fail.
Yep.
So
I was just going to say, absolutely set up to fail. We see it across every sector that women and people of color, LGBTQ plus folks take the lead on something that we're not going to give you resources for, we're not going to support, and then we'll say, hey, look, we tried. Sorry, just
right.
So
yeah,
resonates.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. Right, giving them the opportunity, like, well, we haven't tried this yet, so let's bring in this diverse candidate. Let's give them a try in this setting. So ensuring that they have the resources that they need to be successful and giving them that time. Sport is lagging a bit on the research side in terms of objective stats in this, but I do believe we find that at least for underrepresented men in the head coaching role, they get less time in a position than white men do. So I think it's like a 3-year to 4-year, I'd have to find the research on it, but men from underrepresented groups as head coaches get less time to turn a team around essentially than their white counterparts do.
Yeah, and so if I could just piggyback on that. So I think this is the difference between good intentions and structural change. And I think that every industry has inherited, so, and I'll circle back later if we get there, to, I think, Angelica, your really, really excellent point that when we're building things from scratch, we should not simply adopt practices because they're commonly used. So we have an opportunity there. When I started a business, which for me, coming from academia, it was actually not something I wanted to do. So of course, what I did is I took a class about how to start a business because that's how I learn things, is by the experts telling me and by reading a lot. But I I was told to do market research. If you're going to have a successful business, who's your competition? What's been going on? You know, I wasn't thinking about a storefront, but I would certainly ask if I wanted to open a pizza restaurant, have there been 4 in this place? And why do you think they failed, right? So actually asking all that backstory. And so every institution, every organization, esports, you know, NFL, SUNY, Cortland, where Lindsey is, right? All of these institutions, they have histories. And if we don't assess those histories and we say, okay, let's add some token minorities, and that's the good intentions, right? We want diversity. We know it's good. The structural change says, boy, this glass cliff, we don't have women in the leadership team. Our good intentions have failed, because the proof would be that we wouldn't have these barriers and these disparities. And if you have disparities, it's because you haven't translated your good intentions into, we're going to do something. And just want to say the Rooney Rule, I was thinking about the Steelers and the Gender Equity Commission and the Corporate Equity and Inclusion Roundtable in Pittsburgh. So the Rooney Rule's 15, 18 years old now. It needs updating, but it really was a structural way. It said we need more diversity in the NFL. So we as the Steelers are going to make sure that when we hire, we do things differently, because then the outcome will be different. And so it's been adopted as a Mansfield rule in law, and they've tweaked it. But basically, when you make structural changes, you start to see a change in how many people of diverse backgrounds show up. But that takes time, research. I'm really, I think, jumping on Lindsey's point. It takes time, and it takes doing well, just the way you do any other kind of analysis.
And I'll just add in, because as you're talking, I'm thinking symbolic equality, right? Avoiding that notion of symbolic equality. So don't just bring in the people without giving them the resources and expect them to succeed in those positions. You have to boost them up. You have to have structural and cultural change as well.
So I have a question based off of what you guys are saying. When you're talking about structural changes, I see what you're talking about, but it feels daunting. It feels overwhelming, because in order to make those structural changes, individuals are the people who have to push that forward. And I think that, you know, at least me thinking for myself, or players who are dealing with harassment, or players who are seeing other players be harassed, like, is there something that we can do on an individual level? So we're talking about structural changes and how important and valuable they are. Are individual contributions as valuable and as important? Is there anything that has...
Yes, I would say absolutely. I'll jump in. I would say absolutely. I mean, it's in everything that we do, right? It's part of the reason why I wanted to go into higher education. I'm actually very optimistic. I see some of the young people in my classrooms now, and I see, you know, how, first of all, how diverse my classroom is versus how it would have been many, many years ago. But how they see some of these processes and they're like, why is that happening still? They don't agree with the things that are going on. They're so actually amazed that some of these processes are still happening and some of these barriers still exist and the obstacles, still exist. So I'm optimistic. I think that this younger generation will really help drive things forward as well, because again, it will just take time. And individually we can definitely create change. I mean, we've talked about this on panels before. I really push this idea though of, and I think we touched on this in this panel, those with privilege also need to step up and create the change and speak out and say things, right? So it can't just be coming from, if women and women from underrepresented groups are being harassed in an esports setting, we can't just put the burden on women to then speak up about it, right? And to fight against it, because then you're overburdening them. You're putting more on their shoulders to fix the problems that they're also facing. So individuals can definitely create change. And I do think it starts a lot of ways in education, and it starts early. And you don't have to tell young people everything that's happening, but let's expose them to some of the things that are going on in society, maybe earlier on. So they're aware of it. And so they're kind of pumped up to create the change too. But I keep going back to that time piece, but even at the individual level, I still think it will unfortunately just take some time to get those younger people up into positions where they're creating the change and in positions to make change too.
Is there anything that comes to mind that can be done to help empower not only, like you said, women to sort of stand up for themselves and start sort of pushing for a change, but is there something that can be done to also empower men to become those allies? Like, how important is that role of having, and it's not just male allies, but I'm thinking just for this group mentality that you guys are all talking about, how beneficial it is to have diverse groups, that these groups do so much better, and the organizations that they're part of do so much better. So how do we encourage people to not feel siloed? This is a women's issue and women need to figure it out, or that's a women's issue and they can figure it out. Like, how can we encourage people on that individual level to want to move forward or to become allies?
I have one thing that kind of addresses that, but it's not exactly something that we can create or stimulate, but I've just noticed in past experience that any sort of male supervisor, mentor, in any sort of leadership role, if they have daughters themselves, a lot of times I think they don't want their own daughters denied opportunities. So they almost want to advocate for some of those females seeking some of these higher positions in whatever the corporation or industry might be. But I think I've seen that in the past. And again, that's not something you can just force, but maybe seek out those men who have daughters. But yeah, that's something I've noticed. And just also, somebody touched on this earlier, you know, if you have somebody who's a mentor or supervising you, but just really believe in you, or, you know, whoever the female person is, you know, they know that they're really good at what they do. And they understand that making their inferiors succeed will also make them look good in return. You know, successful people surround themselves with other successful people, and if they can help them succeed up the ladder, it only comes back positively towards them as well.
I want to piggyback on that. I see the same things, and I think so. As I said, I've been interested in interdisciplinary studies, and my research as an academic, I research the American dream, and I'm really interested in what makes people feel part of communities. And so I thought about that from anthropology, and I did ethnographic work and sociology and psychology, but just basically thinking about the different ways in which people come to define themselves as part of a group and are included or excluded. And the American dream for me was a way of looking at a history, because that is, the American dream is supposed to be everyone in this country, the United States, has an equal shot at succeeding. And what I found through my research is that there is very strong belief in the American dream in the United States. Now, my book came out in 2011, and I think we are seeing some cultural shifts, as Lindsey was talking about. But at that time, there was really strong belief in the American dream. And yet, statistically, it was more likely that you would experience upward mobility in Europe than in the US. So the fact was that we had a widening gap between the wealthy and the poor in the US, but Americans themselves said, oh, it's just hard work. So partly we have to unlearn some things that we've learned. And I think, to tie to Sonia's point, research shows that when we're exposed to people who are different from ourselves and given a chance to see them as fully human, we are less likely to then dismiss their problems. We're likely to see, and to sound really humanistic for a second, we do share a planet. So my future and your future, every group's future, is literally linked together. And so rather than thinking that oh my gosh, I don't want to uplift those groups, I don't want to help those people, why are we talking about racism still? That we say, the best society in which I could live, to be safe and secure and be able to flourish, is one in which everyone else can do that too. Having other people being downtrodden doesn't make the world better for me. And so that, like, just to say the individual thing, I think, is just recognizing that it doesn't serve us to see other people as taking from me. That person took my job. I don't want women in the workforce. They're going to get pregnant. And then it's just, you know, there are all these stereotypes and things jumbling around, rather than saying, it's in my best interest that the folks around me flourish too. And so there shouldn't be these barriers. And Rose, I you know, you basically summed up like an hour-long training that I give about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the research there is super robust, that in fact, the paying women less, that people are doing this because of sexism and patriarchal patterns, and they are costing their own companies money, right? Like, so they're implicit biases, and they're taking for granted some common sense mythology about the American dream and who's a better worker and all this, that they're actually doing themselves a detriment. So I think it's also about changing the cultural mindset from, I think games, why I love games and why I'm partly so excited to be in this conversation, is it's healthy competition. I don't need to compete with you for food. I shouldn't need to when we have enough food to feed everyone in the world. Let's compete at who's the better gamer, right? That's where competition belongs, not human against human. So one of the things, just I'll stop talking at the end of this, but just the Gender Equity Commission was formed because of a UN treaty that the US did not ratify. And why I chose, after years of working on gender equity, this job is people's rights and their ability to thrive, which includes getting hired in the industries they want and getting paid in, you know, fairly and treated fairly, not being threatened if they're part of a community or harassed because of their gender, that's a human right. It shouldn't be tied to identity. But the problem is, just to speak for the US, we live in a country where rights were tied very specifically to gender. You had to be male, race, you had to be white, and you had to own property. And so our rights are so tied to those identities. Everyone should have human rights. It's in everyone's best interest. So I think individually, seeing other people's efforts against discrimination, say in the workplace. So if you're a woman, also connecting that with people who are looking for racial and ability, access, all of those things, seeing those as interconnected, we have more power to work against what's the barrier for us. Maybe we can help to get rid of barriers for other people at the same time. So you're also inspiring. I'm just loving this conversation, because you're both saying things that I've heard, but you're saying them from a slightly different vantage. I feel like I just learned, you know, my brain is exploding with learning. So thank you.
And I'll just add in from a coaching perspective. So we're just getting into this. I'm working on a project right now where we are asking men, head coaches, their process of hiring women, why they hire women, all this kind of stuff. So in going off of what Sonia was saying, this isn't an easy thing to do, but those men who come from strong and powerful women, mothers, tend to be the ones hiring more women on their staff. That's a common theme. This is a little insight into that project. We're not even ready to publish yet, but so that's a theme that we're finding is emerging, right? That's not something we can control, but most point to, and they don't even realize they're telling us this information, right? But they point to a strong mother that they had. But even we could just talk to those men. They're head coaches of teams, Division I programs, and they're hiring women to their staff because they recognize that that diversity is critical in their success on the field, on the court. So I would love to actually bring some of, you know, if any of them would ever want to have this conversation too, because they're the ones that are going out there and they're doing it and they advocate for it and they're finding value in it. And it's creating success for their teams and their programs by being diverse in their hiring.
Yeah, that's so cool. So I'm hearing that it's about, you know, empowering women, empowering minorities, helping to get them into a position where people can see them, helping to get them the opportunity. And then I'm also hearing this other aspect of finding allies and specifically supporting, you know, from organizational vantage, supporting, you know, both underrepresented groups, supporting women, and also supporting and promoting the people, sometimes men in this position, who are advocating and who are supporting these other groups, women and minorities. So it's like, there's a few different things that you can do. It's not just about hiring women. It's about putting people in positions of power who do have a track record of being supportive and inclusive, and do have this track record of looking for people outside of their group and trying to bring in new people, right?
Yeah,
and chipping away at the entitlement too. I'll just add that in. So we got to chip away at entitlement, and I think that's across the board. That's in my profession, even as an educator. I know in lower schools, teachers have to do it. Parents obviously have to do it. Boys should not just automatically be entitled to all of these things in these roles. So we've got to also work on chipping away at that, because then it does look like, well, someone stole my job, right? A woman stole my job. This individual stole my job because it was mine. Well, it wasn't yours. You were applying for it like everybody else. So chipping away at that. Sorry, Rose.
No, that's okay. I was just going to add that I think that there are more disruptive leaders out there than we know of, right? I can tell you that throughout my career, I've had a lot of mentors and sponsors and people that really believed in me, that helped propel my career forward. And many of them were men. So I'm like going to give a shout out to the men that are out there doing it every day. And to Sonia's point, a lot of them have, you know, wives at home or daughters at home, but a lot of them just know that it's the right thing to do. So whether it be because you have a, you know, a prominent female figure, or it's just, you know, in your core being to be there and to be an advocate for someone, I think that a lot of men maybe don't know how. Right? They want to be supportive, but how do I? And I think that conversations like this, Angelica, that you're facilitating, and I noticed that in the other sessions, you intentionally had a male in those sessions, bringing them to the table, bringing them into the conversation, because they have that aha moment, or wow, I didn't know it was this way. How can I help? You know, as far as being an advocate, I can be an advocate for women of color, and I am, right? So when we talk about, Lindsey talks about privilege, we also need to acknowledge that, you know, I sit here with privilege. You know, while I can be empathetic to my peers within the organization or outside the organization, anybody that I encounter with that's a woman of color, I don't know what it's like to live in their skin. So advocating for each other. And a lot of times you'll hear, you know, I'll tell you, I don't know how many times I've heard, you know, that women, rather than lifting each other up, they see each other, you know, their peer or coworker as a competitor, right? Someone who's maybe vying for the same job. So it gets to be, for lack of a better word, you know, high school cliquish, if you will. So what can women do to propel each other forward and to allow each other to stand in their light and stand on your shoulders and support one another to propel their careers? So to your point earlier, you talked about advocates and allies. It's not just men, right? It's men, it's women of color, it's all genders and races. It's understanding that intersectionality and how do we move each other forward. To Anu's point, right? We're in it together. Like, isn't it just the right thing to do?
And I will add, because I think this goes off of Rose's point, what we are finding in the research too with this study, so we're doing both men and women head coaches who hire all female assistant coaches. We're finding that those men were mentored or sponsored by women. So all of them had someone in their life previously, whether it was a coach or somebody in the field that hired them, you know, nurtured them, brought them up. And so that is another, I'm letting out probably too much about our research already, but that is another theme that we were finding, which is, to Rose's point, extremely important. It's mentoring and sponsoring those men as well, and giving them the agency to then say, I'm going to hire women and bring women up once I'm in a position to do it.
Can I frame this as changing the narrative, right? Because we have been hearing certain narratives, you know, that when I started teaching gender studies in 2000, a lot of my students would not call themselves feminists. There was a lot less awareness about gender diversity. There was just a conservatism that generationally seems to be less in current college students than 20 years ago for a lot of reasons. And so they are learning new narratives, and the narrative says there are some things that are keeping people behind. It's not just hard work. We're not all just unbiased. Some of us who are older, diversity training used to tell us to say that I don't see color. it was denying the bias that's probably one of the universals, that as human beings, that's our experience. And we can work against our bias, but we need to change the narrative, and really the kinds of things that all of you have been saying, that's what you're doing. You're saying, hey, we can break out of these old patterns and cycles, because they not only keep some people out, but they're hurting all of us. And I think, yeah, I really think that's a great way Lindsey put it.
So I think that this has been such a fantastic conversation, and I know that we have to wrap it up because we're coming to the end of our hour. I just want to say to everybody, thank you so much for joining me. I want to talk to all of you more about all of this stuff, maybe offline or maybe another one of these roundtables. But I just want to say again, thank you so much. This has been such a fantastic conversation, and I really look forward to speaking with you all again. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry I talked so much, but thank you. Thank you. I really,
Thank
really
you all. It was so
enjoyed.
great to meet you.